probably help if I shared my screen first. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, are you seeing the full screen? Great. Okay. Well, yeah, if there's any issues with sound or anything like that, just wave frantically and I'll figure it out on this end. But yeah, it's great to be here with everyone today. Thanks for the great turnout. So we're going to talk about social behavior, spatial ecology, and population dynamics of top predators. So top predators can play important roles in ecological communities, and they impact prey populations through a combination of direct and indirect effects. The direct effects are often pretty obvious, direct killing. The indirect effects may be less obvious and play out through a combination of behavioral or physiological pathways. I would argue, though, that the roles of top predators, like a lot of wildlife species, are not always that well understood and probably sometimes overstated. It's not that I don't think they play important roles. As I said, I think they do, but I think those roles are often very context specific. And yeah, the role that a top predator may play in one system doesn't necessarily translate to the next system. And specifically, I think we've learned a lot about top predators in very remote locations, and sometimes their roles in those landscapes, we're not sure if those really translate to more human-dominated landscapes. What we do know is that their populations are absent, declining, and threatened in places all around the world. And so large carnivore conservation is really difficult. And a big part of that is because they often require large spaces. So they kill large prey for a living, and those large prey are often distributed widely across the landscape. This can make them sensitive to human disturbance, and also they're killed by humans in a variety of intentional and unintentional ways. So I'm going to show you today, I'm going to share with you some results from 3 recent studies I've been working on with my collaborators. And even though at first glance they may come across as being somewhat different, hopefully they're tied together by the motivation of my collaborators and I to understand ecological processes involving top predators in the context of a human-dominated world. And underlying all of this, again, is my motivation to contribute to basic ecology and use that information to inform management and conservation to restore and conserve viable populations. So the first study I'm going to share with you is a study I've been working on with a big group of people, and we're trying to understand social behavior and specifically social cohesion in canids. And the reason I didn't put the authors and the title on the same slide is because I actually couldn't fit them. So we've got a lot of authors on this study, and it's a great collaboration. I'm really excited to be a part of it. And so, yeah, a huge group of people, everyone made great contributions, and we're united by a desire to basically understand more about wild canids. So we're going to talk a bit about group formation and social behavior in carnivores, and it's probably important to point out that most carnivores aren't social. And so only about 10 to 15% of the species in the order Carnivora are what we would consider to be social species that form groups. We can think about the costs and benefits of group formation in carnivores in at least 3 certainly non-exclusive overlapping categories. Costs and benefits associated with group foraging, associated with cooperative breeding, and then group defense, whether it's defending resources or defending offspring or even defending yourself. A lot of times these are tied together in one form or another by kin selection. So if we think about wolves, which we're going to talk about quite a bit, wolves and coyotes for the next 10 minutes or so, a wolf pack and a coyote pack, those are families essentially. So you've got a breeding male, a breeding female, and then you've got offspring from that year, potentially the year before, maybe even the year before that. And so kin selection underlies a lot of this with the understanding that you can favor your kin in certain activities in a social group that involves your family. So a lot of the previous work looking at carnivore sociality has focused, and rightly so, on thinking about optimal group size in these social carnivores, and then trying to think about what are the outcomes across the variation in group size that we see. Things like per capita energy that's gained in different group sizes or fitness benefits. We've learned a lot from these studies. Of course, there's still a fair bit of confusion and debate about some of it. And I would argue there's another component that's important to carnivore sociality, and that's cohesion. That's what we're going to talk about quite a bit today. And what I'm calling cohesion is essentially the amount of time you spend with the other individuals in your social group. Okay, and so if we think about, maybe an evolutionary decision to become social, then there's another decision, and that's once you're in a group, well, should I be with the other group members or apart from them? And that may play out differently across different days and across different hours. And it might be influenced by the activity that you're involved in at that given time, potentially by the environmental context, and potentially by the intrinsic traits that you yourself possess. So my interest in this question dates back quite a few years. When I was a PhD student, my advisor and I, Brent Patterson, published a paper, pretty simple paper. We had 5 packs in which we had at least 2 GPS collars in the same pack. These were wolves. And our basic question was just, are wolves in a pack always together? Or more specifically, how much time do they spend together? And at least initially, it was a very practical question. So I was tracking wolves, and I often only had 1 GPS collar in each pack. And so I was really interested to know, well, does that data tell me about the behavior of just an individual, that individual wearing the collar, or does it tell me about the behavior of the whole pack? So we did things like compare habitat use and home range size when we had multiple collars in the same pack to address that question. It's also popped up a number of times in research and management previous to our 2015 paper. For instance, in Yellowstone, the fascination with the potential behavioral responses of elk to wolves. A lot of that was done with GPS collars on both elk and wolves. And then it was pointed out that, okay, so you're maybe seeing a behavioral response by elk, but you don't have all the wolves in that pack collared. So how do you know there aren't uncollared wolves running around when you think predation risk is low? So that's one context where understanding more about cohesion might be important. Another would be even more practical. The way that we survey wolves, without getting into all the details, if you're counting wolves, you're counting tracks and assuming that all of the wolves in that pack are together on the day of the survey, you better be right about that, or you're going to underestimate density and abundance. So knowing how much time they spend together and the probability that they'll be together is important. Now, we certainly weren't the first ones to look at this question. A lot was learned early on with VHF data by people like Dave Meach, Rolf Peterson, Francois Messier. And our work with GPS collars really confirmed a lot of what they found, which most importantly, there's a big seasonal difference. Wolves are more cohesive. They spent more time together during winter than in non-winter months. And these are actually the values from our work. And it showed that same pattern, more cohesion in winter. But what it also showed is there was more variation than previously recognized. Certainly with a GPS collar, you can track them more intensively around the clock. And the earlier work suggested often in winter it was 70% or above. We found quite a bit of variation there. And so I became really fascinated with the idea of trying to understand what's driving this variation, knowing full well as I progressed with our 2015 paper that there was no way I could do it in a single study area in Ontario with basically five packs. So that leads us to the question for today's talk, or the first part of the talk. And our hypothesis here is that cohesion in canid social groups varies widely relative to a variety of intrinsic and environmental variables. And so we made specific predictions. I'm not going to list all those, but we'll see how some of them played out as we look at the results. Our methods are pretty simple. So to participate and to contribute data to the study, we needed to have GPS telemetry from at least 2 canids within the same social group. If we had that, then we could estimate cohesion. So we're going to define cohesion as the proportion of simultaneous locations from those 2 animals in the same social group that are within 100 meters of each other. So basically, we're looking at times when wolves, coyotes, and other canids are in close proximity. And here's a look at the data, which I find pretty exciting. A lot of great contributions from around the world, and you can see we have multiple species. It's certainly North American biased and heavy on the wolves and coyotes, but we also have golden jackals from India and Serbia and dingoes from Australia. So jumping into some results. So on the y-axis here, we've got the cohesion coefficient. Again, that's the proportion of time based on GPS data that the animals in the same groups are together. And we got the different species. So we've got gray wolves, eastern wolves. From Ontario, we also had some mixed ancestry wolves that didn't fit perfectly in any group. Red wolves, coyotes, dingoes, and jackals. If you look at the dingoes and jackals, unfortunately, we probably don't have representative samples there, pretty small sample sizes. By the way, these sample sizes are number of pairs, not number of individuals. What you can see is some pretty stark differences jumping out between, say, wolves and coyotes. The red wolf value here is a little bit misleading. So this is just a descriptive statistical plot. It doesn't account for the number of influences that influence cohesion. And so actually, when we put red wolves in the models, there was no difference, not a strong difference between their cohesion, eastern wolves and gray wolves. And so here's where we start to see some of those important influences in terms of species, season, and breeding status. Okay, so again, we have the cohesion coefficient here. We've got wolves and coyotes on this plot. And for the rest of the way, due to the small sample sizes, the modeling results are all focused on wolves and coyotes. Unfortunately, we couldn't include the dingoes and jackals as much as we wanted to. So you see differences between wolves and coyotes, but you also see differences between breeding pairs and other types of pairs. So the breeding pairs are in gray. The other pairs include breeders with non-breeders or non-breeders with non-breeders. So the breeding pair is the male and the female. So we can see that breeding pairs are more cohesive. We can also see, similar to the previous data we talked about, that during winter, we see a lot more cohesion in both wolves and coyotes than we do in non-winter. And that's particularly true for the breeding pair. So here's an interesting result. We had a spatial covariate, a index of human modification to the landscape, a global covariate, and we found an influence of this human footprint index on social cohesion in canids. And so there's actually a difference between winter and non-winter. So again, winter is the season when canids are most cohesive, and during winter, in areas with very little modification to the landscape by humans, we see the highest cohesion, and it falls off as you get into areas that are increasingly dominated by human alteration to the landscape. It kind of levels off there in a nonlinear trend, and we didn't find that effect, at least strongly, in the non-winter season. Some other interesting influences. So unfortunately, we didn't have pack size for all our data. Pack size is a difficult thing to estimate with certainty for wolves and coyotes, but we did find for both species that cohesion declines in larger packs. So if you're in a bigger social group, you're less likely to be with any given other individual. Also, interestingly, we found that this is just for wolves, but we had a nice spread of wolves that were sympatric with beavers and wolves that weren't. So beavers are an interesting prey item. They're one of the smaller prey items that wolves eat with any regularity. So there's certainly some study areas and some seasons when beavers dominate the wolf diet. We tend to think of wolves mainly eating large prey like ungulates, and they certainly do. But beavers can be important too. And when beavers were present, and so they're probably feeding on smaller prey, we did see less cohesion in those wolf packs. Okay, so what have we learned so far? And I say so far because these results are relatively new, and I'm actually hoping to write the paper during the winter break. So I'm excited to dig a little deeper and hope to have more for you soon. Well, certainly foraging is important, and that's not a big surprise. As I said earlier, it's a big reason why we might see sociality in carnivores. So we see that through the prey size, specifically with the effect of beavers being present and less cohesion. And so it makes sense that when you're feeding on larger prey, you would tend to be more cohesive with your pack mates, potentially less so with small prey. Also, I think at least part of the seasonal effect has to do with large prey. So during winter, canids tend to be eating larger prey and smaller prey during summer, and we see that big difference in cohesion across season. And also some part of the effect of breeding pairs is probably also has to do with feeding. Research with wolves has shown that the breeding pairs generally do most of the work when it comes to taking down large prey. So they have strong reason to be cohesive in winter when they're often feeding on ungulates. Cooperative breeding is clearly also important. And I think it's interesting to think about, I catch myself thinking about cohesion as sort of a proxy for sociality, but it's just a component of sociality. And so in winter, the breeding pairs together a lot, and that's again because their job is the same. They're both trying to hunt large prey, probably. During, say, for instance, the pup rearing season, so we have denning and rendezvous season, that makes up the non-winter season. They have different jobs. And so a female may be in the den, often is in the den with the pups nursing, while the male might be anywhere around the territory finding food, bringing it back to provision the female and the pups. And so by the very nature of their cooperation, they're actually less cohesive during that season. Interesting that humans disrupt social cohesion. And so we can sort of add this to the list of things that humans disrupt in terms of wildlife populations. And so recent global work has shown, for instance, animal movement changing in time and space relative to increasing human footprint. Work from Jared Ballant's lab showing increased human-caused mortality relative to human footprint. Our work potentially adds to that by seeing that even social cohesion and social organization in carnivores can be disrupted by intense modification to the landscape. So some next steps, I'm really excited, we have these trends that we're seeing here, we have these influences on cohesion, but the really cool thing is we also have GPS data on all the animals involved. And so it'd be really cool to start looking at what the animals are doing when they're together and what they're doing when they're apart. And I think that will hopefully lead to a more mechanistic understanding of social cohesion in canids. And the ultimate goal here is to provide new insight to the nature of sociality in canids and potentially even shed some light on the evolution of canid sociality to begin with. How did it evolve to begin with? Okay, we're going to shift gears kind of violently here and talk about spatial ecology of large carnivores relative to human activity. And I just want to introduce a smaller list of co-authors for this study, and that's Heather Abernathy from Virginia Tech, Jeff Sikich, and Seth Riley from the National Park Service. Okay, so I think we all probably understand that animals tend to alter their movements around humans. And theory predicts that animals should use space and move efficiently. And by that, I mean they should use the smallest home ranges possible and move very efficiently. So use those small home ranges within which they can acquire the resources necessary for survival and reproduction. However, the response of animals in terms of their movement to humans is often very species and context specific. And so we can look at some recent studies and see some pretty disparate results in terms of the response of animals to human disturbance. And so here's a global analysis by Tucker et al. In their science paper 2018, wide variety of mammals with GPS collars. And what they found overall is that with increasing human footprint, you see less movement essentially. And so they concluded that due to anthropogenic barriers on the landscape to movement, animals are moving less when there's more human modification. We can contrast that with some work from a single population. So this is work from Stan Garrett in the metropolitan Chicago area. And what we're seeing is a pretty different result. So here we're looking at increasing home range sizes as a function of increasing urbanization within their home ranges. And so here, the animals are using more space and presumably moving more relative to a higher degree of fragmentation. And so we can contrast these two potential outcomes for animal movement. In the Tucker paper, they're suggesting that perhaps animals move less due to anthropogenic barriers. In work like Stan's, and there's other work showing this, you can imagine that these animals may be moving between disjunct patches of suitable habitat in a highly fragmented landscape. So these disparate results have really led to a general understanding of the response of animals in terms of their movement to humans as being pretty elusive. So fast forward to COVID-19, I'm sure we all wish we could rewind, but it's clearly changed human behavior on a global scale. And this might present an opportunity for ecology. And so several review papers have pointed this out. And specifically that the idea is, can we take advantage of this reduction in human activity or potentially an increase in some areas to understand more about how animals respond to human disturbance? And I think what's important here potentially, or one thing that's important, is for the first time in some areas, we may actually see human activity being decoupled from human infrastructure. And certainly we're all aware of the anecdotal accounts of strange behavior by wildlife during COVID. We're unaware, at least yet, I'm sure they're coming, of empirical studies actually quantifying these changes in behavior. And so here's coyotes walking the streets of Tel Aviv, mountain goats in Wales, deer in Japan, even showing up in the subways. And our study system is mountain lions in the greater Los Angeles area. So here's P22, the Hollywood lion, as he's sometimes known. And he lives in Griffith Park, right in the city of Los Angeles. So that's on the right side of the graph here, at least my right. That's Griffith Park. Here's the city of LA. This is the Santa Monica Mountains. In red, these are the areas that were used by the mountain lions we were tracking. And green is important because green are the parklands. And so in a highly fragmented urbanized landscape like Los Angeles, you can imagine mountain lions are going to be occupying these parklands, and they certainly do, as you can see. And that's important because as we get into mid and late March, the governor of California issues a stay-at-home order. And between the 27th of March and the 9th of May, most of the parks in the LA area were closed, including the ones throughout our study area that these mountain lions are occupying. And so that presented us with an opportunity to try to quantify the response to reduced human activity. And we hypothesized that large carnivores would use the landscape more efficiently with this reduction in human activity. And we predicted reduced space use, reduced movement rates, and less avoidance of human infrastructure. So did human activity actually change in the parks? Well, the data we have suggests it did. So these are Google mobility data, and they're tracking changes in human activity. It's actually based on cell phone and handheld device data, and it tracks the number of visits and the length of stay in specific areas. So these data actually come from parks in LA County and Ventura County across their study area. What you can see is that during the period of the parks closure from late March to early May, we do see a pretty dramatic reduction in human activity in the parks. It starts to increase after the parks open again. This spike here is actually Memorial Day weekend, so it gives us some faith that these data are actually telling us something real. Now, the majority of the animals we tracked were in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, a unit of the National Park Service. The Park Service tracks visitation rate. So you can see here, what we've got in blue is visitation in the 10 years prior to COVID from January to August. Quite a bit of variation, but really pretty similar across these 10 years. The big change is in 2020, between March and May, during the period when parks were closed. You see the big outlier during April, visitation really falls off the map. So we have some pretty good evidence that humans were less prevalent on the landscape during the COVID park closures. And so what did the animals do? And so our first prediction is they would use less space, or they would use space more efficiently. So this is our study area. Here's P22 over in Griffith Park. These are the Santa Monica Mountains. And so the solid polygons are their historical space use for each of these resident animals. And then the hatch polygons are the COVID space use. So this is space use estimated during the 43-day parks closure. And what we did with the historical data is actually we estimated space use over sequential 43-day periods. And then we compared the COVID space use to the mean value of their historical space use and saw if the COVID space use was lower and did it fall outside the 95% confidence interval. And the numbers aren't really important here. I should say actually, for the blue, this is P19, an adult female, and this is P22. We had about 8 years of tracking. So we really understood, I think, their historical space use. And so we were able to see, basically, does their COVID space use differ strongly from what they've done throughout a lot of their lives? Less data for these two, but still, I think about 2 years of tracking. And so again, you don't have to focus on the numbers, but in each case, the COVID space use was below the historical mean and importantly, outside of the 95% confidence interval. So our first prediction is supported. Yes, they were using less space during the COVID parks closure. What about movement? So movement, here we've got GPS collars taking a fix every 2 hours, and we're estimating mean step length, again, during historical behavior relative to the COVID parks closure. So this is before the closure, here's after the closure. And we did it across either 2 or 3 daily periods. So we have daytime, crepuscular, and nighttime. We only had that for P22. Most of the collars were programmed to not get a lot of daytime locations because generally we think that mountain lions don't do a lot of interesting things during the day. We weren't really expecting COVID. So we were actually able to change P22's collar remotely and jack up the diurnal locations. But what we see is not a big change at night or crepuscular for P22, but during the day, we do see a pretty big change. So before the park's closure, he's moving about over 200 meters every 2 hours on average, probably less than 50 during the park's closure. P19, not a big difference during crepuscular periods, quite a bit of variation there during COVID. But we do see a pretty strong difference in her movement during nocturnal periods. She's moving about 400 meters every 2 hours before COVID, and yeah, about 200, a little bit less during COVID. Whoops, sorry about that. So P54 was the last one you can see. She moves less during both crepuscular and nocturnal periods pretty strongly. So these results aren't super conclusive, but I think it's pretty interesting. So what we've got here, we estimated the mean distance between diurnal locations and the center of nighttime activity for that subsequent night, okay? So within a 24-hour period. So again, mountain lions tend to use rest sites during the day. They're probably laying around at rest sites mostly. And at night, they're foraging. And so we wanted to ask, is this reduction in movement potentially facilitated by them being able to set up their daytime rest sites closer to where they're going to be foraging the next night during COVID with fewer humans on the landscape? As you can see, the results aren't that conclusive, particularly for P22 and P19. And I think one of the issues here is we've got a ton of variation. So we see the trend that we were predicting, but there's so much variation because it was only 43 days. And you can only get one of these distance values every day. And we had some misfixes. And so there's no difference really with 22 and 19. 54, however, does fit with our prediction in that she's setting up her daytime rest sites closer to where she wants to be at night. And so there's probably an energetic benefit there. And that's probably one mechanism by which she was able to reduce her movement. Okay, finally, resource selection. We did a number of resource selection models. I'm just going to show you one. This is for resident females. We had 7 females in this model. Kind of an irritating graph probably, but it's not that bad. So we've got landscape variables across the top, either natural or anthropogenic variables. And then the red or blue circles are resource selection coefficients. If they're above 0, above this dashed line, that means avoidance. If they're below, that means selection of the given feature. We're going to focus on the anthropogenic variables associated with our prediction. I'll just gray out the rest. What you can see, so blue is resource selection before COVID, red is during COVID. You can see that before COVID, they're avoiding trails. After COVID, they're actually selecting trails. Development, we see a similar trend. There's actually no selection or avoidance before COVID, but the trend is avoidance, and then we see selection during COVID. Now, it's important to point out these are distance-based resource selection functions, so it doesn't mean the cats were walking the streets. In most cases, obviously, they weren't. But what it does mean is they were closer to trails and development during COVID. So something I've been thinking about that maybe explain, or anyway, I think our results speak to this a little bit, is like a lot of things in ecology, I think scale is really important. So if we're trying to rectify some of the disparate results about how human disturbance might influence animal movement, it doesn't solve all our conflicting results, but I think it explains at least some of it in that we need to consider scale. Okay, so let's take P22 as an example. The Hollywood lion here, he's using a home range in Griffith Park. It's actually the smallest home range we think ever recorded for an adult male mountain lion. We've got a paper in review showing that home range, and it's pretty obvious why. These are 3 of the busiest freeways in the world. And of course, this is the 2nd biggest city in the country. And so this animal is using a home range that's completely surrounded by either really busy freeways or intense urbanization. Okay, so at the landscape scale, when it's selecting a home range and occupying this home range, clearly his movements are constrained by human disturbance. But as we saw with our COVID work, within that home range, with humans on the landscape in normal, if we can consider LA normal, at normal levels prior to COVID, he's actually on a finer scale moving more potentially or presumably to dodge around human disturbance and avoid human activity. Whereas during COVID, he was able to use that space at a fine scale more efficiently. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Animals clearly can respond quickly to changes in human activity to increase efficiency, and even in areas with a very high human footprint like Los Angeles. And so this implies that large carnivores lose efficiency while avoiding human activity, again, under sort of normal circumstances in a city like Los Angeles. And I've sort of been thinking about this perhaps in terms of a similarity to indirect effects suffered by prey species when they're avoiding predation risk. So here we have large carnivores avoiding human activity. They appear to be suffering an energetic cost, and that could translate to reduced fitness and even scale to population dynamics. And in a threatened population, which we'll talk about in a second, like the Santa Monica Mountains, that certainly doesn't help the situation. The rest of this is sort of speculation, but I think it's interesting. So potentially this could cascade to community structure. You can imagine if large carnivores are paying energetic costs, moving inefficiently, they have to make up that deficit somehow, and how are they going to do it? Well, presumably they're going to do it by killing more prey. And so if they do that, potentially it could have a different effect on prey populations and maybe influence the community in a different way. And then lastly, there's work out of Colorado to suggest, and it makes sense, that mountain lions, when they kill livestock, they tend to do so when they're in a desperate or hungry state through risk-sensitive foraging. And so again, if we're pushing animals potentially more into these desperate, hungry states due to loss of efficiency in their movements with intense human activity, could this potentially exacerbate human-wildlife conflicts? I'm not sure, but I think it's worth thinking about. What's interesting is clearly there's a lot of statements in the literature talking about large carnivores avoiding humans, and this being a mechanism that promotes coexistence. But potentially that could use some rethinking if in fact there are cases where wildlife might actually get into more conflict in some ways due to the lack of efficiency around humans. Okay, so the last study I'm going to share with you is about small population dynamics and management and how we manage them. And so my co-authors here are Peter Mahoney, Kyle Gustafson, Jeff Sikich, Winston Vickers, Paul Beyer, Walter Boyce, Holly Ernest, and Seth Riley. Okay, so we've already talked about the Santa Monicas shown in blue here. And this is the Santa Anas. Actually, as a postdoc with my colleagues there, we were modeling the population dynamics of these two isolated populations. And so we think there's about 6 to 8 adults at any one time in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's a bit bigger in the Santa Anas, but still a small population, maybe 13, 14 breeding adults. And both are similar in that they're surrounded by freeways and urbanization. And they actually have the lowest genetic diversity for any Western mountain lion populations that have been documented. The only lower population of mountain lions were Florida panthers, which, as you may know, in the 80s and 90s almost went extinct due to complications associated with inbreeding depression. So there's a lot of concern about local extinction of mountain lions in these two isolated mountain ranges. And one management strategy that's been proposed is a highway crossing structure. So this one's for the Santa Monicas, and it would be right about here. And so these are the Simi Hills. And the idea would be, we know there's mountain lions over here. In fact, we're tracking some of them with telemetry. And so to build this vegetated highway crossing structure, this is an artist's rendition. If we could basically get animals to move into the Santa Monicas, bring new genes with them, and mitigate some of these small population issues and maintain genetic diversity. The problem is a big price tag. So they've done a lot of good work raising funds for this, but they're not there yet. And we decided to model the population dynamics. We did a PVA to understand the dynamics and the threats, and also to understand the influence of additional immigration. And so it's an individual-based stochastic projection model. We had a lot of great empirical demographic and genetic data, and this allowed us in this individual-based framework to actually simulate individual breeding events by mountain lions and realistically simulate the resulting genotypes in their offspring. So importantly, we're starting with empirical genetic profiles, and then using Mendelian genetics, we can actually estimate genotypes going forward And this allowed us to estimate population growth, extinction risk, and genetic parameters at any point in the future going forward. And also, we were able to investigate different levels of immigration. For this, we used genotypes from animals that have been sampled just outside of these isolated mountain ranges, and we simulated what would happen if they came in. So here's a figure from our 2019 paper. And this first graph, this ignores genetics, okay? This is purely demographic processes. So we're looking at the mean extinction probability predicted from our model after a 50-year projection. And we've got an increase in immigration along the x-axis. So this is no immigration, a closed population, all the way up to 1 immigrant per year. What you can see is that even ignoring genetics, just purely through demographic processes, we see extinction probability really decline with increased levels of immigration. So in the Santa Monica's, for instance, we go from about 30% predicted extinction probability to about 2 or 3% with 1 immigrant every year. So this really highlights the importance of connectivity even before we consider genetics. So let's consider genetics though. So here's observed heterozygosity on the y-axis predicted by our model. And then again, we have these increasing rates of immigration. So 4 scenarios ranging from no immigration to 1 immigrant every 2 years. And on the x-axis, this is our 50-year projection. Okay, so this shows us the predictions for how genetic diversity might erode if going forward with varying levels of immigration. You might be wondering what the red line is. Well, the red line is the level of genetic diversity at which Florida panthers experienced inbreeding depression. Okay, so this is a value of genetic diversity that we don't want to see in California populations. And you can see with no or low immigration, the model predicts will fall below that in 50 years. With slightly higher rates of immigration, 1 immigrant every 4 years or 1 every 2 years, the mean trend actually stays generally above it. There's a lot of variation, but it looks like with basically essentially 1 immigrant per generation, we can largely maintain genetic diversity in this isolated population. Okay, we're on the home stretch here. So how can we rescue or manage these small populations? Well, one option clearly is translocation. And so that's how Florida panthers were genetically restored. They moved cougars from Texas into South Florida. It restored their genetic diversity. The population took off as a result. I don't know that that's necessarily on the table in California, but it's certainly a management option. And we think it could be useful because it could be very flexible. What I mean by that is you can choose who you bring. Okay, so our first prediction here is that adult males will have the greatest genetic impact because of 2 things. Number one, they're adults, they're of breeding age, and so they're more likely to actually breed. If you bring a subadult, they still have to survive to adulthood, and then they have to actually successfully breed. So that's helpful. And then because it's mountain lions, which have a polygynous mating system, bringing males is probably your best bet. A male will mate with, if he's successful, mate with multiple females and really spread those genes around the population more than we expected females would. The other part of the flexibility is you can choose where you bring the animals from. And so we predicted, makes sense, that if you bring animals from a more diverse source population, you can have a greater impact on these isolated populations. Another option would be highway crossings. I talked about that. That's on the table, and there's attempts to fund that as we speak. We think this will generally lead to immigration by subadult males. Subadult males are certainly the most, they disperse the most often and they disperse the farthest. Females do disperse, but they tend to disperse shorter distances, and they don't undertake risky dispersals the way males often do. And so with highway crossings, we expect it would be largely biased to subadult males. And then there's also the possibility of artificial insemination, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So what we did with our model for this next part is we actually used the model to make quantitative predictions. So we simulated these 3 management strategies, and it allowed us to make quantitative predictions regarding the genetic and demographic outcomes of specific management prescriptions. What's really kind of interesting is it's not just sort of comparing these different techniques. Also, you can basically understand, well, what's the genetic impact and how often would we have to, say, translocate animals, or how many immigrants do we need to come in to really achieve the management goals that you're after. So a couple slides of results for this. Again, this may be a bit busy, but this is expected heterozygosity, okay, and these are model predictions with the exception of the first coefficient here. This is the starting population, okay, starting genetic diversity. Again, if it's a closed population, after 50 years, you see this precipitous drop off in genetic diversity. And here's where we compared the different age and sex classes, and it kind of looks like stair steps, right? So basically our prediction was supported. The most impactful age and sex class was adult males. And we also compared local source populations. So we used the genetic profiles that we had in the greater LA area, but outside of these isolated inbred populations. And then we used the more diverse population. Holly Ernest had genetic data from the Sierra Nevadas, and we were able to use that. What you can see is in each case, we do see a bigger boost from a more diverse population, a source population. Oh, sorry, I should say that for this graph, what we're doing here is 7 translocations in our 50-year projection. So basically every 7 years, more or less, we're bringing in a new animal of one of the age and sex classes. Okay, so here's where we sort of look at translocation and immigration in the same framework. Again, expected heterozygosity, starting population, precipitous drop-off without any immigration. And here we have the frequency. So either we have translocation or immigration every 10 years, 7 years, 5 years, 2 years, or every year. I didn't do each technique in each of these different frequencies, but you get the idea. And what we see is, okay, well, let's say the goal is to maintain genetic diversity. Okay, so here's where we're starting. Basically what you can see here is if, oh, and I should also say this is all adult males. After we determined that males were the most impactful, we decided, well, if we're going to translocate, we should bring adult males. So with adult males from a diverse source population like the Sierras, you could maintain your genetic diversity by translocating every 7 years. In terms of immigration, shown in green, so these are subadults coming across the highway crossing structure simulated in our model. Basically, you would need an immigrant to come across about every 1 or 2 years to largely maintain genetic diversity. Okay, so how should we manage? Well, what about highway crossings? So the model predicts they'll succeed if they're, basically if they can be funded and constructed. Really expensive, but the beauty of it is once it's up, it's a sustainable long-term plan that should help maintain genetic diversity. And I think the real benefit, the kicker, I think, for highway crossings is it's multi-species, right? So Seth and his group with the National Park Service, it's not just mountain lions. They've showed isolation effects and low genetic diversity of bobcats, coyotes, songbirds, amphibians. If we can actually get that big vegetated land bridge, potentially it could benefit many species, whereas if we're translocating animals, obviously you're just bringing the focal species. However, translocation did appear to be effective as a targeted tool. I think one of the drawbacks is it's a never-ending management strategy, at least for these populations. What I mean by that is, it's effective when you're bringing animals, but as soon as you stop, the model shows genetic diversity starts to decline again, and there's such small populations, it doesn't take long before you're really losing genetic diversity again. So if you're going to sign up for translocation, you're going to have to do it indefinitely. However, it might be a good stopgap. Say, for instance, if those highway crossings don't get funded or it takes a long time to get funded, and we start to suspect maybe that genetic diversity has really declined to alarming levels, potentially you could use some targeted translocation to get you through that period until the highway crossings are erected. And if we think beyond Southern California, beyond mountain lions potentially, I think, we can see that both are effective. And so potentially using some combination of highway crossings and maybe occasional targeted translocations, potentially you could really have some beneficial effects on small populations. And finally, I didn't show any of the results with artificial insemination. They were pretty interesting, but we actually don't think it's very practical with mountain lions. And so the reason I say that is that mountain lions raise their offspring for 13 or 14 months. They're raising kittens, and then they have this really narrow window. In our populations, it's usually like a week to a month before they breed again. And so you've got this narrow window. We don't catch adult females very often. And so the chances of actually catching them in that narrow window and being able to artificially inseminate them are pretty rare, I guess, unless you were prepared to disrupt natural reproduction in some way. Also, interestingly, it had the least impact of the three techniques. And I think you can probably see why. With artificial insemination, you're only impacting a single litter. Okay, if you bring an animal through translocation or one comes across the highway structure, well, then that animal, if that animal breeds, it might breed multiple times and have an impact on multiple litters. Additionally, if through artificial insemination, those kittens have to survive to subadulthood, then to adulthood, they have to breed. If those things don't happen, the whole thing doesn't do you any good, basically. Okay, so can we conserve top predators? I would say yes, and I think our work supports that. I think clearly if we're thinking about the Los Angeles area and a lot of human-dominated landscapes, protected lands are important. I think that's a big reason why mountain lions have persisted in the Los Angeles area, but clearly going forward, restoring and maintaining connectivity are key to long-term success. Probably a lot of reasons to feel negative about things. We're talking about high rates of inbreeding, human-caused mortality, the potential for local extinction. But I'd like to end on a positive note. And I think, if we can do it in LA, we can probably do it anywhere. And by do it, I mean conserve large carnivores in a heavily human-dominated landscape. Okay, so we're talking about the largest cat in the United States and the second largest city in the United States. So I think if we can pull that off, and the modeling certainly suggests it's possible, then I think that bodes well for our ability to conserve large carnivores in a variety of landscapes that are often probably less human-dominated than LA. Yeah, and with that, I'll just thank all our many funders and supporters of the mountain lion research there. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, John. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat. So I guess, John, while everyone's thinking about their question, what is the mechanism about people that causes the big predators to disperse and move out? Is it just being disturbed, like actually coming into close contact with them and they're purposely leaving? Or is there some other factor, changing the prey, move, that kind of stuff?
In terms of like behavioral avoidance and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I think for most of them, obviously it probably varies across species and systems, but I think for most of them, it's probably the historical, like in an area like LA, it's now illegal in general to shoot mountain lions, but I think, they sort of evolved knowing that humans are really bad and it hasn't gone well when they've interacted with humans. So I think that's a big part of it. Actually, I don't really have time to get into it now, but depredation killings, so basically retaliatory killings for livestock depredation through permits are a way that mountain lions can be killed in California. And we've kind of been thinking about that question, what happens when human behavior changes? Mountain lions are used to avoiding them and thinking humans are going to kill us, but now they don't, or only a certain subset do. And we feel like it could even be an ecological trap where they're no longer able to perceive reliable cues about who's dangerous and who's not, because how are they going to know that this one rancher is dangerous, but all these other people aren't? So, yeah.
It seems to me that like the ones in LA would be just so super desensitized to humans and human movement.
Yeah, what's really amazing is they're not. So like P22 there living in the city, he's rarely seen. I mean, it's just insane if you Google if you look at Griffith Park on Google Maps and just see where it is, the fact that he's almost never seen is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. All right, we got several comments and questions here. This one's from Carolyn Jezierski. Very interesting research. Thanks for the presentation. Next is a question from Larkin. Always great to hear about this work. What are the odds that you put today on having those overpasses built? Do you think that it has been affected by COVID-19 related budget issues?
I hadn't thought of it relative to COVID, but yeah, I don't have exact odds, but I will say that since I became involved in this work in 2014, I think at first I was extremely pessimistic. It just seemed like an uphill battle that probably wasn't going to work out. I can't remember where they're at, but we'll say that multiple millions have been generated for that. There's a pretty big amount of momentum. It's nice now too that we have some science backing up that it should be beneficial. If I had to guess, I'd say it will happen. If I had to guess when, I have no idea, but I think eventually they'll get there. And I think it may be a little bit insensitive because it's not probably going to be funded. Well, it's not going to be funded by the government, right? So it's going to be funded probably largely by wealthy foundations, conservation organizations, et cetera. And so I think those wealthy foundations probably still have deep pockets, even with COVID. I hope so.
All right, the next one's from Dave Wadeen. There have been recent genetic studies dating the origin of domestic dogs. At some point, those are wild canids by humans. Any thoughts on this jump to domestication?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, Dave, but one thing I tell my students in our class, in mammalogy, we start with, well, what's the first domesticated animals? And, the obvious one would be livestock, but it's actually dogs. And I mean, the mechanism there is the thinking that we were both hunting some of the same things. You may know all this, Dave, but we're hunting some of the same things. And some wolves were probably actually pretty tolerable. And so we did some artificial selection where we killed the ones that were a nuisance. We kept the useful ones, and gradually probably were helping their pups. They became comfortable with us and essentially became dogs. I hadn't really thought of cohesion in domestic dogs. I think somebody came at me with, we've got some collars on some feral dogs. Would you want to use those? And I honestly don't remember why we didn't, but it would be kind of interesting. I don't know if that addresses your question, Dave, but those are my thoughts on domestic dogs, I guess.
Here's one from Peter Mahoney. Great talk, John. Quick question regarding the COVID response in the SMM. With recent and anticipated closures associated with the lockdown in California, do you anticipate repeating your analysis with winter data?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess it kind of depends, how that plays out. I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do with parks. I think the beneficial thing for our work here, because certainly I've told people about this work, and one reaction I've gotten is, well, weren't there more people in parks during the COVID closures? Because they got, they're not going to work, they got nothing else to do. And certainly that's where people would have been. It's because they closed the parks. But I think now that we're starting to understand that being outside is a pretty good thing, I think it really hinges on whether they close the parks, whether we'll see that reduction in human activity. However, if they don't close the parks, I suppose we could redo it and look at a spike in human activity, which might actually be more interesting. So, I think it's possible we could potentially do this, redo this. I think we're all hoping, if we're not just thinking about wildlife research, I think we're all hoping it doesn't continue very much longer. But actually, as I was sort of excitedly talking about some of the research possibilities with COVID, one of my co-authors looked at me kind of oddly and said, wait, do you want this to continue? And I said, no, I didn't mean that. I just meant like if it does continue, we could do X, Y, and Z. So anyway, I thought that was pretty fun.
The next one's from Eric Vanderwall. Hi, John, nice talk. With a polygynous breeder like a cougar, what are the chances a new male in a new environment could successfully compete for mating opportunities?
Yeah, great question, Eric, and nice to have you here. So behind the scenes there, we wrestled with that. Peter, who actually just asked a question and was instrumental in the modeling here, we thought that one through, and right, so you're dead on. It's not as simple as you bring an animal and it breeds, right? You bring an adult animal, and particularly in a place like the Santa Monica's, even though it's such a small population, quite often it's probably at carrying capacity or very close. And so we reckon there's 1 or 2 slots for breeding adult males in the Santa Monica's, and those slots might be filled. So you translocate an adult male, there's going to be a fight. There's no question about that, and someone's going to lose. And so we tried to take the most assumption-free path, and we just said there's going to be a fight if both slots are taken and you're at carrying capacity. And we gave the odds as 50-50. The resident defends the territory, kills the incoming male, and that male never breeds. And of course, then you don't get the genetic benefits. Or the incoming male kills the resident and does get to breed, and then you get the benefit. So that actually is all figured into the model, with the exception of we don't know what that real probability is. I suppose you could argue the resident has an advantage because it's on familiar ground. On the other hand, they're highly inbred. Maybe the incoming male is somehow more vigorous or something. So we went with 50-50, but it's an excellent question. And I think we feel a little bit maybe better about it in some ways with mimicking natural dispersal with a highway crossing, but really the same process is going to play out. If a male comes into the Santa Monica's across the highway crossing structure, in order to breed, there's going to be a fight and someone's going to die. So yeah, that's all sort of behind the scenes, and we don't have good values for those numbers, but that's how we did it.
Okay, the next one is from Adam Mortensen. If there are limited connectivity points for lions to move, would lions be able to restrict movement of other lions? Could a dominant male kill young males trying to disperse across the bridge? How many connectivity points are enough?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, certainly that's what we've actually seen, and pretty high rates of intraspecific aggression. So it's actually evened out where human-caused mortality is caught up to the aggression, the strife mortality. When I first started working there, the leading cause of death, and I think it still is the leading single cause of death, is mountain lions killing other mountain lions. And what happens is just like you said, these males without a highway crossing are trying to disperse out of the mountains. They can't find any way out without crossing those huge freeways. In fact, Adam's in my class, and I think I showed one of these slides maybe during class, and it's almost sad because you see the GPS locations go right up to the development or the freeway, and they kind of sit there, and you can almost imagine them looking at the freeway, just thinking, nope, not today. And they turn around, come back into the mountains, and we literally had multiple subadult males come back into the mountains and get killed. That said, it's a relatively small area. I think they would find those, dispersing subadult males will move quite a bit. I think they would find those crossings, but to your point, would 3 crossings be better than 1? Absolutely. But I think we'll take one $60 million price tag at a time, and if they can get 1 up, that would be a step in the right direction.
Okay, the next is from Amber Schlitz. Great presentation, thank you. Do you know of any similar studies? Do you know if any other similar studies were able to take advantage of reduced human visitation this spring on predator behavior or animal behavior in general, and if similar results were found?
So to answer your 2 questions, yes and no. So I am aware that there's other groups and people working on the same question with GPS data and doing it at different scales. So, and actually I'm working with another group, and we're looking at this question in national parks across the country rather than just, in a single study. I think there's a group working at a global scale. In fact, I think it's the Tucker et al. Group again, going to try to look again at global movement relative to human footprint. In this case, though, the foot maybe has come out of the footprint. So we'll see what they come up with. But I don't know what any of these other studies have found. And certainly I'm looking at Google Scholar on a regular basis and wondering what day I'm going to get scooped if we don't get this paper out pretty soon. So yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see. And yeah, it would be very interesting if we see a range of results from more movement to less movement. But to me, the prediction of less movement makes a lot of sense. You just think that humans are a real hassle for wildlife, and when you remove them, they're able to move much more efficiently. Yeah, anyway, that's what we saw in LA.
All right, from CPhil 2. With P22's small home range surrounded by LA, what is he likely eating to survive?
Yeah, hey, Chris. So he's eating mule deer largely. So we've done my colleagues have done a fair bit of kill work and primarily eating mule deer. Of course, the way that we do the kill work is biased towards large prey. So other things he's probably eating include, well, he's certainly killing occasionally coyotes. Whether he eats them or not is another story. Domestic cats, raccoons, But the diet is probably largely mule deer. But it's a great question because, if we think about that small home range, okay, so yeah, it's restricted by human activity, but nothing can change the fact that he still has to get enough to eat. And so how do you pull that off? There must be a fair bit of mule deer in Griffith Park. We're actually we've been trying for a while to get funding to study deer in Griffith Park in the Santa Monica Mountains. And we're actually moving that forward in the Santa Monicas, hopefully Griffith Park at some point. We'd love to know more about how many deer are in there, what are the predator-prey dynamics, et cetera. But my guess is there's quite a bit of deer in Griffith Park. Otherwise, right, how could he be using only 24 square kilometers? Of course, the other reason males have such big home ranges is because they're trying to visit multiple females. Well, P22 doesn't have that problem, or I should say that luxury, maybe. There are no females in Griffith Park. And so basically, I think what we can assume about P22 is he's got lots of food. We know there's no females, so he doesn't really have reason to go farther, and he's probably not going to take his chances across those freeways. Of course, he already did. He got in there as a subadult. He came from the Santa Monicas, which is just an unbelievable trek, right? Crossed some huge freeways and somehow made it in there. There's actually a group, there's like an event every year in LA called P22 Day. And a group of people get together and they hike. We don't know, we didn't have a collar on him at that point, but they hike the possible dispersal path that he took to get to Griffith Park. So kind of a cool event. But
all right, I hope I don't mess up this person's last name too bad. Stella Uderwall. Do you think individual predators are more likely to encounter each other if they're essentially funneled into highway crossings? And how might that affect those predators?
Yeah, good question. Right, so what I think mostly what we're trying to do is reduce local extinction probability if we put up those highway crossings. But certainly another benefit is what we were talking about before, that these subadults will be able to disperse out, and maybe that would reduce conflict with the dominant males and reduce mortality. But you make a good point. If we're funneling them to a small, narrow highway crossing, they might bump into each other, a fight starts, and the very thing we're trying to avoid actually happens. I think, the fact of the matter is there's not very many of them, and we'd be pretty excited if they were using the crossing enough that they were actually bumping into each other. So, if an occasional fight starts there, I think that collateral damage would probably be offset by the benefits of all that immigration and emigration. But it's an interesting thought, and it's one of those things where you try in conservation, you try to manage in a way that's beneficial, and sometimes you might do things that aren't exactly beneficial, and that could be an example.
All right, I think that's all that I have here, unless someone's got a last second one to roll in. I'll wait one more second. One thing I'd like to say, Larkin reminded me about this, is we had several students trying, Larkin's in my class, undergraduate and graduate students trying out our seminar class this semester. I think it's gone pretty well. So I want to thank you all for giving this a shot. If on any sort of course evaluations, please let Larkin and I know any way that we can improve that. I think that's it. John?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. I saw actually quite a few familiar names, not faces, but from around the country and even outside the country. So I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one. See you, John.
See ya. Thanks.